Let's dive right in. Go ahead, grab the default cube, and delete it. From there, I'm going to hit Shift-A, add in a plane, S and 3 to scale it up a little bit, Control-A to apply that scale, and then tab into edit mode, right-click, and subdivide a few times. Something like this should be fine. From here, I'm going to add a subdivision surface modifier of 2, and that's just going to give us a little bit of a smoother bend. And then I'll also add a solidify just to drag this out and give it a little bit of thickness, and a bevel modifier as well, with 2 segments, a limit method of angle, and an amount that is smaller, let's say 0.01. That's going to give us nice edges. We can also right click and shade smooth, and now we can actually get to the bending. To do the bending, Shift-A, add in an empty plane axis, and then rotate that R, X, and 90 degrees. Then we will grab our plane again, add a new modifier, namely a simple deform, change to bend, and for the origin use that empty. Now what you'll notice right now is that we have this uniform bending across, and what I would like is for it to only bend on one side, so that we could create the peeling away effect for layers. That's very easy to do. I'm just going to hit 7 to come into top view, then I'll hit Control-Tab and drag over to Weight Paint. You'll notice everything has turned blue, and that means that all of these have no vertex weight to them. But when I grab this gradient tool and starting at the top, clicking just off over here and dragging down, you can see I'm now creating this gradient across the actual plane. Once I'm done, just release, and now Control-Tab again, come back to Object Mode, and you can see nothing has changed, but when I come under Restrictions for Vertex Group, I now have the option of grabbing this group that I just created. When I do that, you can see everything is bending quite nicely, and I can control that bend to a great extent, largely folding in just this area. You may notice a slight hump right there, but we can remove that quite simply by hitting 3 for side view, Z for wireframe, tabbing into edit mode, and then just dragging a box over all of those verts that we do not want to be bending, coming to the Object Properties tab, and under the Vertex group, choosing Remove to remove those verts. And you can see it now just falls flat. So if we come back into solid view, you can now see this is very simple. We can either go from 0 or all the way up. You can, of course, animate this property so that if you wanted to, on frame 1, you could start by having no bend whatsoever, adding in a keyframe here. Let's jump ahead, say 60 frames, and we'll bring this bend up to about 135 degrees and simply insert a keyframe. Playing that back, we now have this nice smooth bend of that film. One of the things that's really nice about this approach is that you can also use it and bend off surfaces. So let's say I want this to be wrapping around something, and to do that I'm going to Shift-A, add in a cylinder, give it a good number of cuts, or verts rather, so let's say 64, then I'll rotate it on the x-axis 90 degrees, drop it below my plane, and I'm going to scale along in the y direction, scale uniformly, and then drop it down a little bit and scale it in the x direction just so that there's a curved surface that this can rest on. I'll bring it up just a little bit, and the only goal here really is to have the plane be smaller than the area that you're wrapping around. Right click, shade smooth, grab the actual plane, and what we're going to do from here is simply add another modifier, namely a shrink wrap, and we're going to make sure that we move this above the solidify. From there, I'm going to change the wrap method to project. I'll use Z so that it wraps down, negative so that it does actually wrap in the Z on the negative direction, and for the target, I'll just choose the cylinder. You can now see that we're wrapping on this cylinder, so this is a nice layering effect if you were doing something like a medical animation, or if you were doing something along the lines of a flexible electronic device. So from here, we can now actually go back to our simple deform, and not only do we have this wrapped onto the surface, but if we press play on our timeline again, you can see we can actually now peel away off our surface. If we wanted to make a stack device, all we would have to do is Shift-D, Z, and move up. And you can see that doesn't actually want to play along right now because right now the shrink wrap is still matching for the original object. To fix that, all we're going to do is we're going to change the target to the first plane. And now, one thing that you have to note here is that this plane has to be bigger than that one. And this approach will actually fall apart pretty quickly, so it's not the best for multiple curved objects. It's usually best for 1 or 2 if you have to pull it away. I tend to use it for that effect. And of course, if you do not have the shrink wrap enabled, then you can simply bend as you want. So deleting all of that will also remove the shrink wrap from here. Delete this first plane and simply duplicate this one, bringing it just about into the right place. You can actually use and apply array modifiers to be a bit more concrete with this, and actually that's what I'm going to do. So I'll go ahead, delete that, add in an array modifier, change it to 1 in the relative direction and 0 there. And because this is actually a plane, we're going to have to use constant offset because I want to place the array at the top of the stack, and then I'm going to apply the array. So I'm just going to move this up, actually, whatever the value of this thickness is. So copy that, paste it into the Z offset, and make it positive. And now I will simply add the number of layers that I want, so let's say 5, and I'll apply this array, tab into edit mode, select everything, and then hit P and separate by loose parts. I now have 5 different planes that are perfectly stacked and all have the appropriate modifiers, which means that if I want to, for each one I can come in and I can actually bend all of them. So I can bend the first one off, then I can bend the second one by a lesser extent, third one similarly, etc., etc. From here, I'm going to transition to using a lattice modifier for something a little bit more complicated, and I'll be back in just a second. So here we have a very quick model of essentially a perovskite. It's missing all of the finer trimmings, and if you're interested in those, I'll link a tutorial in the description, but we want to actually bend this object. Now, right now, this is actually just the single piece over here and a number of modifiers that are making it a bit of a more comprehensive structure. I'm also going to make sure that I enable merge on each of these arrays because I do want them to actually all be connected, and we're actually going to bend this. Now, if I were to try and do a simple deform, that can be a bit of a nuisance because I do want to preserve this array. So you can see what I could try is I could add this empty, I could move it into place roughly over here into the middle of the perovskite, and then I could rotate it again 90 degrees. And when I go ahead and try and add that simple to form with a bend and using that empty as the axes, you can see this is actually not bad. Again, I'm now going to run into a problem though. How am I going to use a vertex group to create the uniformity without applying everything above it? And the answer is I'm not going to be able to do that. But there is a very convenient workaround, and that is to use a lattice modifier. So I'm simply going to hit Shift-A, come down to lattice and add this in. And now if I hit 1 for front view, what you can see is I'm just going to hit G, X. I move the lattice pretty much right into the middle, just about there, G and Z, and again I'll move it into the middle here. And coming into the side view, we will also move it into the middle, which is right about there. And then I'm going to scale this lattice in all of those directions until it just covers the edges of the perovskite that I've created. For the front view, and there we go. Now from here, I'm going to come down to the object data properties for the lattice, and I'm going to increase these numbers until I have a number of cuts that essentially frames it very nicely, which is convenient for this because it is essentially quite cubic. Again, coming into side view, and we'll do the same thing here, bringing that resolution up until it essentially matches dead on. And what we're going to do is very simply, we're going to apply that bend to the lattice, and then we're going to use the lattice as our way of controlling the bending. So let's go ahead, add a simple deform. We've already put the empty in the right place, and so we can simply choose that for bend. And again, what we're now after is to bend just part of this perovskite. So I'm going to grab the perovskite, I'm going to add a lattice modifier, and I'm going to choose the lattice we just created. You can see the perovskite's now bending quite uniformly, but I can now add a vertex group to the lattice itself. So what I'm going to do there is just tab into edit mode, making sure I'm in wireframe again, drag out over these boxes, and then actually invert that selection, add a vertex group, assign it, and you can see coming back, if we go to the lattice, to the modifier properties, and to the restrictions, we'll choose that vertex group, and now the perovskite is bending quite uniformly. You do have a limited range that you can bend before you're going to start seeing a little bit of contraction here. That's just because it is trying to preserve this distance so that they don't overlap. In other approaches where you use something like particles on a plane, they will end up falling into each other, so this way actually preserves the geometry. It's just a little bit tight after a certain point. So there is a limited range that you're going to want to use this approach for, but this is a nice way to achieve that effect. And you can of course control the extent of bending either through the angle for the simple deform on the lattice itself, or if you really want to set the lattice bend quite substantially, then you can simply grab the perovskite and control the strength through there, and you hide the lattice so you don't have to see it when you're working with it. And so this is a nice way to be able to bend more complicated layers, but again, just be aware that you're going to see some degree of warping if this is an approach that you end up using. So as always, thanks for coming out. Hopefully this was useful. If it was, consider subscribing, sharing with your friends and colleagues, and until next time, you have yourselves a great old day.